Hello and welcome to another video. Now, the week after this debuts, I will be speaking at the conference PGConf Russia. I've been a speaker there many years, for the last few years. Of course, this year with COVID, it's entirely online, but this has led me to theme this particular episode with Russian food. Now, for my American viewers, you're probably familiar with beef stroganoff in an American context, in an American way. But this is originally a Russian dish from a couple hundred years ago, and there are a lot of aspects of this dish that are not well understood in American cooking or the American versions of the dish. So we're going to go ahead and cover that today. We're going to make a Russian beef stroganoff, and a fairly simple one. And I'll talk a little bit about the points of extension and what other kinds of things people add to it. But we're going to serve it also in the traditional Russian style alongside mashed potatoes rather than on top of egg noodles, which is the way Americans serve it. So with that in mind, this is a great dish. It's flavorful, and it's quite, and it also forms a basis for some aspects of cooking that you'll see throughout Northern and Eastern Europe. So, for example, Stroganoff type recipes are fairly common in aspects of Swedish cooking, for example. So, let's go ahead and talk about ingredients. So, the basic dish is basically stewed strips of meat. In this case, I just got some stir-fry beef from the grocery store, but you could take like a steak and slice it. It would probably be the easiest way. And if you're using a tougher cut of meat, then we just stew it a bit more afterwards. We'll talk about that later. Onion, salt and pepper, and of course sour cream, and a bit of broth. That's the absolute minimum for the dish. Typically, you'll also see mustard added, as well as tomato paste and paprika. Now, you can add some white wine. We'll talk about that. And some people add mushrooms. We'll talk about that. And there are some other things that can be done to kind of liven up the dish or kick it up a notch. But for today, we're just going to focus on a very, very, very basic one. So no mushrooms, no white wine, just the basics. And it's also worth noting that not every recipe includes mustard, not every recipe includes tomato paste, and not every recipe includes paprika, but the three of these together kind of form a fairly common combination in the Russian versions of this recipe. So I will go ahead and be back once I'm done with the prep, and basically we will serve this on mashed potatoes. So one common aspect of Russian versions of this dish is that rather than julienning the onions, that we cut them into quarter rings. So I've quartered the onion, and I'm going to slice it basically like this. Now this is a bit harder on your eyes than julienned onions. But they cook just very slightly different, and so it's worth mentioning this aspect. There we go. And so now we're basically ready to start our cooking. So I'm going to start with a mixture of cooking oil and butter. And I'm going to go ahead and heat this up until it's very nicely melted and starting to bubble. And then we'll go ahead and cook the meat in this without any seasonings. So of course I have my potatoes cooking here, and we're just making basically a serving of this. On a medium-high heat now I have this bubbling. And I'm going to start spreading out these strips of meat. Now the goal here is to fry the meat relatively quickly and sear in the flavor. So I'm just basically going to slowly add the meat, and then once I have it more or less at the maximum, you don't want to add too much meat at once, because if you do that, what's going to happen is the juices of the meat will come out, and that's not what we want on this particular dish. So the meat's going to stick to all the butter solids, which is fine. And then, but you know, once I have these, once I have them turned over, I can make them a little bit more dense and add some more of the meat here. And then once the meat is seared, I'm going to put it back on the same plate. We don't have to worry about cross-contamination here because we're not done cooking this, and this is going to cook quite a bit more. So take some of this out. Flip more of it over. Put it closer together. Rotate the rest of it around. Put the rest of our meat on the frying pan, and we'll be done with this in just a couple moments. So I'll be back as soon as this is done, and we will start with the onions. Now at this point, usually I'm going to stir the. Okay, so I've taken the meat out, and at this point I'm going to stir the fat a little bit to make sure that all of the juices and stuff are fried away. And then I'm going to add my onions. Now the goal here is not to caramelize the onions, is to brown them. There's a difference. Caramelization is usually a slow process with onions, and that would take a long time. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add these here. I'm going to start to add a bit of salt. I'm going to add some of my pepper. I will add more pepper later. And then I'm going to stir these together. And I'm going to let the onions start to brown. Once they brown, once they start to brown a bit, I will add the meat back in. And note that initially they're going to turn kind of brown, but that's from the meat drippings. It's not from the it's not from starting to brown themselves. So we want to cook these for a little bit. Let them actually cook, and then we'll go from there. And I usually do this whole section at about a medium high on an electric stove, maybe a medium on a gas. So I'll be back when these are browned, and then we'll go from there. So now you can see the onions are turning translucent and brown on the edges. That's kind of what we want. So I'm going to add the meat back in. I'm going to stir this together a little bit. Now, if I were to add wine, I would deglaze things with wine here at this point. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to deglaze it with a bit of beef broth. I'm going to turn the heat down from like a medium high down just a little bit lower than medium. And it doesn't take a lot of beef broth. Just enough to deglaze it. Now once the beef broth is in, I'm going to add just a bit of mustard. So mustard will be the next ingredient. Now here I'm using a German medium mustard. If you're in the US, I would say add a bit of Dijon. I don't know Russian mustards well enough to comment on that. And if it starts to dry out a little bit, you can add a little more broth. But the next step will be, we'll add the rest of the seasonings, and we'll cover this and let it simmer for a bit. So I'm going to start with my sour cream. And add a bit of tomato paste. And I'm going to add my paprika. Now this is the spicy variety of paprika, but the sweet variety would work fine. I'm going to stir all this together. And then if needed, I will add a little bit of water. After you've added beef broth a couple times, you probably want to stick with water, just for salt content reasons. So I'm going to add just a hair of water, and then I'm going to cover this and let it cook for a little bit. So I add just like a few tablespoons of water just to make it a little bit more moist again. I'm then going to put a lid on top of this. I'm going to let it simmer for a bit. You can do two things at this point. You could add a little bit of flour to thicken it up, or you can go ahead and do a reduction. I think in this case I'm going to go ahead and do a reduction. So I'm just going to let some of the water evaporate until the sauce gets thick again. So in this particular case, the meat has become tender very quickly. So I'm not going to simmer it for very long. It's been maybe 5-6 minutes. If I had a tougher cut of meat, I could simmer it in for another couple of hours if needed. So now I'm just going to go ahead and let the sauce reduce. And while it does that, I'm going to prepare my mashed potatoes because this is not going to take very long. So I have some fairly thick mashed potatoes here. There are a few different ways you can do the mashed potatoes. Today I made them a bit thick. That's kind of a matter of choice. In another video I'll probably come back and cover mashed potatoes in some more depth. Then I'm just going to take my tongs. I'm going to spread out the beef kind of to the side. And now we have basically the stewed beef mixture here next to our mashed potatoes, and this ought to be fairly good for a meal. Now for garnishes, I like something green, and I like to get something out of the garden. Obviously, people don't usually eat the garnish, but it's good to assume they might. So in this case, I've decided to take a carrot leaf. I'm just going to go ahead and set it up like that. Or maybe like that. Just something to make it a little bit more, yeah, I think I'll do that. Just something to make it just a little bit more classy. And the fact is, carrot leaves are edible. They're great in salads, or soups and stews and that sort of thing. So great for this case. And now for the taste test. Wow. That's amazing right there. This is absolutely delicious, rich. I can't find the words to describe how good this is, so I'm just going to leave it there. Hope you enjoy making this. Bon appetit.